Don't expect a single dollar of this estate, you idiot. My lawyer's going to bury you in court." My father's voice slammed across the probate courtroom so hard that even the clerk behind the desk stopped typing. A few people gasped softly. Someone in the back muttered, "Jesus Christ." I didn't react. At 78 years old, Richard Carter still knew how to command a room. Thick silver hair, expensive gray suit, gold watch visible beneath his cuff. Even sitting down, he carried himself like a man who believed the world belonged to him. And for most of his life it had. 3 construction companies across coastal Georgia, commercial properties, rental homes, a marina outside Savannah. More money than anybody in our family ever thought possible back when my grandfather was fixing shrimp boats for cash. But money had changed my father. Or maybe it had simply revealed who he already was. The courtroom smelled faintly of old paper coffee and furniture polish. Ceiling fans turned lazily overhead. Outside the tall windows, rain tapped against the glass. My younger brother Daniel sat behind my father with his arms folded, pretending not to enjoy the humiliation. My sister Linda stared down at her lap, avoiding eye contact completely. I stood alone at the petitioner's table, just the way they wanted it. My father pointed at me with a trembling finger. "She abandoned this family 20 years ago," he snapped at the judge. "Now she shows up wanting a payout? Absolutely not." The judge, an older woman named Harriet Coleman, adjusted her glasses calmly. "Mr. Carter," she said, "you will lower your voice in my courtroom." My father leaned back, furious but silent. Beside him sat his attorney, Robert Hensley. The moment I saw him earlier that morning, I recognized him instantly, despite the extra wrinkles and thinning hair. Robert still had the same sharp jawline, same careful posture, same habit of folding his hands together before speaking. For the first 15 minutes of the hearing, he hadn't looked directly at me once. That told me everything. He already knew who I was. I slowly turned toward him now. "Robert," I said quietly. His eyes finally lifted. The room suddenly felt very small. "Do you remember me?" For a second, nobody moved. Then all the color drained from his face. His mouth opened slightly. "Wait," he whispered. My father frowned. Robert stared at me like he'd seen a ghost. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "you were Navy JAG." The courtroom went silent. Even the rain outside seemed quieter somehow. My father looked between us confused. What the hell is he talking about? I kept my eyes on Robert. The last time we'd seen each other was nearly 16 years earlier at a military legal conference in Norfolk, Virginia. Back then, I was Commander Evelyn Carter, U.S. Navy Judge Advocate General's Corps. Robert had been a civilian consultant assisting an internal fraud investigation involving military contractors. A messy case. The kind powerful people wanted buried. I helped expose it anyway. Robert never forgot. Apparently neither had I. Judge Coleman leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Hensley," she asked, "is there an issue?" Robert swallowed hard. "No, Your Honor," he said automatically. But his voice lacked confidence now. My father leaned closer to him. "You said this would be simple," he hissed under his breath. Robert didn't answer. That worried my father more than shouting ever could. I finally sat down, slowly smoothing the sleeve of my navy blue blazer. At 52, I had learned something important about conflict. The calmest person in the room usually holds the real power. My father had spent his entire life mistaking volume for strength. Judge Coleman reviewed several papers in front of her. This hearing concerns the Carter estate restructuring and the petition filed by Ms. Evelyn Carter, requesting review of recent asset transfers, she said evenly. Daniel scoffed loudly behind my father. "Asset transfers," he muttered. "Here we go." I ignored him. The truth was, I hadn't returned to Savannah for money. Not really. I came back because something smelled wrong. 3 weeks earlier, an old family friend named Margaret Lewis called me unexpectedly in Norfolk. Margaret had worked as my mother's church friend for over 30 years. She sounded nervous on the phone. "Your father's changing everything," she'd whispered. "Properties and accounts, signatures. Honey, I think somebody's taking advantage of him." At first, I almost ignored it. After 2 decades of distance, I'd built a peaceful life away from my family's chaos. I taught legal ethics seminars now. Quiet work, quiet home, quiet mornings drinking coffee near Chesapeake Bay. Then Margaret said something that changed everything. "Your mother would have wanted you to look into this." That sentence stayed with me all night. My mother had been gone 11 years. Breast cancer. Fast and cruel. She was the only reason I ever came home after joining the Navy. And if I was being honest with myself, losing her was the moment I truly lost the rest of my family, too. Judge Coleman looked toward Robert again. "Counselor, are you prepared to proceed?" Robert blinked like he'd forgotten where he was. Yes, Your Honor. But he still couldn't look at me comfortably. My father noticed. I could see it in his face now. The confidence was slipping. Slowly. Quietly. Like sand beneath a collapsing foundation. Daniel suddenly leaned forward. "This is ridiculous," he said. "She disappears for 20 years and now suddenly she cares about Dad." I turned toward him calmly. "You transferred 6 properties in 14 months, I said." Daniel's face tightened instantly. "That's business." Into shell companies. So what? While Dad was under medical supervision. My father slammed his palm against the table. "That's enough." Judge Coleman raised her voice sharply. "One more outburst and I'll clear this courtroom." Silence returned. Robert rubbed his forehead. For the first time since I walked in that morning, he finally spoke directly to my father instead of around him. "Richard," he said quietly, "there are some things we may need to discuss privately." My father stared at him in disbelief. "What things?" Robert hesitated. That hesitation changed the entire room. Because powerful attorneys don't hesitate unless danger is real. My father's confidence began draining from his face the same way color had drained from Robert's earlier. I knew that look. Fear. Not fear of losing money. Fear of losing control. Judge Coleman announced a short recess. The moment her gavel struck, conversations exploded across the courtroom. People whispered. Daniel stood abruptly. Linda still wouldn't look at me. My father grabbed Robert's arm aggressively. "What's going on?" he demanded. Robert glanced toward me one more time. Then he quietly said words that made my father go completely still. "She's not here for the money." And suddenly, for the first time in 22 years, my father looked afraid of me. When the courtroom emptied for recess, I stepped into the hallway and stood beside one of the tall windows overlooking Reynolds Street. Rainwater slid slowly down the glass. Savannah always smelled the same after a storm. Wet pavement, salt air drifting in from the river, magnolia trees soaked dark beneath gray skies. For a moment, I forgot I was standing inside a courthouse preparing to fight my own family. Then I heard my father yelling down the hallway. "She's bluffing," he snapped. "That's all this is." Daniel answered in a lower voice I couldn't fully hear. Robert said nothing. That silence told me more than words ever could. I folded my hands together and looked outside. At my age, people expect anger to cool down with time. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it hardens instead. I hadn't spoken to my father for almost 4 years before Margaret called me. But the truth was, our real separation started much earlier. Long before lawyers, long before courtrooms. Back when I was 18 years old and foolish enough to believe my father might someday be proud of me. In 1992, our family lived in a large white house outside Savannah near the Wilmington River. Back then, my father was still building his business. He worked constantly. Construction contracts during the day, financial meetings at night, every conversation at the dinner table eventually turned into money growth expansion or loyalty. Especially loyalty. My father valued loyalty above almost everything else. "You take care of family," he used to say. "Family takes care of you." What he really meant was, "Do what I say." My brother Daniel loved that arrangement. He worshipped my father from childhood, followed him to job sites every weekend, learned equipment names before he learned algebra. Linda stayed quiet and agreeable. But I was different. I loved books, history, debate, structure, rules. And somewhere around 16 years old, I started realizing something dangerous. I didn't want my father's life. I wanted my own. The summer after graduation, I sat at our kitchen table staring at Navy recruitment papers, while my mother washed dishes quietly beside me. "You really want this?" she asked softly. "I do." "You know your father's going to fight you." "I know." My mother dried her hand slowly. "She'd make a good officer," she murmured mostly to herself. I smiled. "You really think so?" She looked at me then with tired but gentle eyes. "Evelyn, you were never meant to stay small." That conversation stayed with me my entire life, especially after she died. My father came home an hour later carrying rolled blueprints beneath his arm. He immediately noticed the paperwork. "What's this?" I answered carefully. "I'm joining the Navy." The room went completely still. My father stared at me like I'd announced I was moving to the moon. "You're what?" "I already spoke with a recruiter." "You're not joining the military." "I already signed preliminary papers." His face turned red almost instantly. "For God's sake, Evelyn," why he demanded. "You're smart. You could go to law school here in Georgia. You could help build this family." "I don't want construction contracts." "You don't even know what you want." "Yes, I do." He laughed once cold and sharp. "The military," he said. "That's a waste of a smart woman." My mother quietly said, "Richard, But he ignored her. "You know what happens in the military," he continued. "People bark orders at you for 20 years, then throw you away." I looked him directly in the eye. At least I'd earned my place. The second those words left my mouth, I knew I'd crossed a line. My father stepped closer. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means I don't want everything handed to me. I built this family from nothing. And now you think you own everybody in it." My mother whispered my name nervously, but neither of us stopped. My father pointed toward the door. "If you walk out of this house chasing some fantasy, don't expect to come crawling back later." I still remember the silence after that. The old kitchen clock ticking, the hum of the refrigerator, my mother quietly crying beside the sink. I left 3 weeks later. The morning I departed for training, my father didn't come outside to say goodbye. Only my mother did. She hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe. "You call me whenever you can," she whispered. "I will." "And Evelyn?" "Yeah. Don't let hard people make you hard too." I nodded back then like I understood. Truthfully, I didn't. Not yet. The Navy changed me. Not in the dramatic Hollywood way people imagine. No heroic music, no perfect victories. Mostly it changed me slowly. Early mornings, long deployments, endless discipline, responsibility. I learned how to stay calm under pressure, how to speak carefully, how to read people before they spoke. Eventually, I attended law school through the military program and entered JAG. That was where I finally found purpose. Military law isn't glamorous work. Half the time you're dealing with exhausted young service members making terrible decisions far from home. The other half you're dealing with powerful people trying to protect themselves. I became good at seeing through lies. Maybe because I grew up around them. Over the years, I handled fraud investigations, misconduct hearings, and contract abuse cases involving military suppliers. That reputation spread. By my 40s, younger officers sought my advice regularly. Meanwhile, back home, my father told people I'd abandoned the family. Margaret once admitted church members whispered about me constantly. "Richard acts like you betrayed him personally," she'd told me years earlier. Maybe I had. Or maybe I simply refused to belong to him. I came home only once for longer than a weekend. My mother's funeral. I still remember standing beside her casket while rain hammered the church roof. My father never cried publicly. Not once. But after the service, when everybody else left, I found him alone in the fellowship hall, staring at one of her photographs. For a moment he looked very old, very tired. I almost walked over. Almost. Then he spoke without turning around. "You leaving broke her heart." The words hit harder than any scream ever could. I left the next morning before sunrise. And after that, years passed, quietly, until Margaret's phone call dragged me back to Savannah once again. Back to courtrooms, back to old wounds, back to my father. A soft voice interrupted my thoughts. "Commander Carter." I turned from the courthouse window. Robert Hensley stood several feet away holding a paper cup of coffee. He looked uneasy, older than before. "May I speak with you privately?" he asked. I studied him carefully, then nodded once, because something in his face told me the real fight hadn't even started yet. Robert led me into a small conference room at the end of the courthouse hallway. The room smelled faintly of dust and burnt coffee. One long wooden table sat beneath harsh fluorescent lights, and a faded American flag leaned awkwardly in the corner beside a filing cabinet. For a few seconds neither of us spoke. Robert closed the door carefully behind him. Then he let out a slow breath. "Well," he muttered, "this is one hell of a reunion." I stayed standing. "You look nervous." "That's because I am." He gave a tired little laugh and loosened his tie slightly. 16 years earlier, Robert Hensley had been one of the sharpest civilian attorneys I'd ever encountered. Confident, controlled, impossible to rattle. Now he looked like a man carrying something heavy. "You recognized me immediately this morning," I said. He nodded once. "The second you walked into the courtroom. And yet you still took my father's case." Robert rubbed his jaw. "I didn't know you were involved when I accepted it." I crossed my arms. "But now?" He hesitated. "That depends. On what? Whether my instincts are right." Outside the room I could hear faint courthouse noises. Phones ringing, shoes against tile floors, somebody coughing somewhere down the hall. Real life continuing while families quietly tore themselves apart behind closed doors. Robert finally pulled out a chair and sat down heavily. "You remember Norfolk?" he asked. "I remember the contractor fraud case." His expression darkened immediately. "That investigation destroyed careers." "No," I corrected calmly. "Corruption destroyed careers." He gave me a long look. "You always talked like that." "That's because I was usually right." A faint smile touched his face despite himself. There it was. Recognition, respect, maybe even fear. Not fear of me physically, fear of what I represented. Truth. Robert leaned forward slightly. When I saw your father's estate records last month, he said quietly, something bothered me. I said nothing. He continued. Large property transfers, sudden LLC formations, medical authorization changes, power of attorney revisions. My stomach tightened slightly. Exactly what Margaret warned me about. How bad, I asked. Robert lowered his voice further. Bad enough that I started making copies. Now that surprised me. Why? Because your brother Daniel pushes too hard. He paused. Men who are honest usually don't panic every time paperwork gets reviewed. I looked toward the door briefly before answering. Daniel always wanted Dad's approval. Robert nodded. I noticed. There was another silence. Long. Measured. Finally, Robert said something unexpected. You know, after Norfolk, people talked about you for years. I raised an eyebrow slightly. I'm sure not kindly. Actually, he shook his head slowly. Most people respected you. That caught me off guard more than I wanted to admit. In military law, respect rarely comes directly. Usually it arrives disguised as caution. Robert looked down at his coffee cup. You walked into rooms full of powerful men and never once acted intimidated. I was intimidated constantly. Could have fooled me. I almost smiled. Almost. He reached into his leather briefcase and slid a thin folder across the table toward me. I probably shouldn't do this, he said quietly. I opened it carefully. Photocopies. Property deeds. Transfer records. Bank authorizations. And one signature page that immediately made my chest tighten. My father's signature looked shaky. Unnaturally shaky. I looked up slowly. When was this signed? 6 months ago. He was hospitalized 6 months ago. Robert nodded grimly. Exactly. I turned another page. One of the waterfront rental properties had been transferred into an LLC connected to Daniel. Another commercial property showed partial ownership reassigned to a woman named Teresa Molina. I frowned. Who's Teresa Molina? Your father's in-home caregiver. That landed hard. I stared at him. You're telling me my father transferred property ownership to his caregiver. 40% stake in one holding company. That makes no sense. It gets worse. Robert slid another paper toward me. Medical scheduling records, neurology appointments, medication adjustments, cognitive evaluations. I felt my heartbeat slow the way it always did before difficult legal confrontations. Cold, focused. How bad is his condition? I asked quietly. Robert hesitated carefully this time. Some days he's perfectly sharp, he admitted. Other days? He stopped. Other days? He forgets conversations. I looked down at the documents again. My father had always terrified people with his memory. Numbers, dates, contracts, debts from 30 years earlier. The idea of him forgetting things felt almost impossible. And suddenly, beneath all my anger, I felt something else. Sadness. Robert studied me carefully. You still care about him, I answered honestly. I don't know. He nodded like that made perfect sense. At our age, emotions become less simple than younger people imagine. Love and resentment can live inside the same heart for decades. Robert leaned back in his chair. There's more. He reached into his briefcase again and removed a sealed envelope. Yellowed with age. My breath caught instantly. I recognized the handwriting before he even handed it to me. My mother's. How did you get this? Margaret Lewis. Of course. Robert explained quietly. She gave it to me last week after she learned I represented your father. My fingers trembled slightly as I took the envelope. On the front, written in faded blue ink, were 6 words. For Evelyn if things go wrong. Suddenly, the room felt too small. Too warm. My mother had died 11 years earlier. And somehow, she had seen this coming. Robert stood slowly. I haven't read it, he said respectfully. I nodded without speaking. After a moment, he moved toward the door. Then he stopped beside it. There's something else you should know, he said. I looked up. I withdrew from representing your father 10 minutes ago. That surprised me again. Why? Robert opened the door halfway before answering. Because I've spent 30 years practicing law, he said quietly, and whenever decent people start hiding paperwork, he looked directly at me. Ugly truths usually follow. Then he left. I sat alone in the conference room holding my mother's letter while rain continued tapping softly against the courthouse windows. For several minutes I simply stared at the envelope. Part of me didn't want to open it. Because once you uncover the truth inside a family, you can never put it back again. Finally, slowly, I slid my finger beneath the seal. Inside was a single folded page. My mother's handwriting looked shaky but careful. I unfolded the paper, and the very first sentence made my stomach drop. If you are reading this, Evelyn, someone in this family has betrayed your father. I read my mother's letter 3 times before I could fully process it. The paper trembled slightly in my hands. Not because I was afraid, because hearing my mother's voice again, even through faded handwriting, felt like reopening a wound I had spent 11 years trying to survive. Her letter was short, very short, but every sentence carried weight. Richard trusts too easily when it comes to family, especially Daniel. Please don't let anger blind you, Evelyn. Your father has many faults, but he does love his children in the only way he knows how. And then the final line, watch the paperwork. That line stayed in my head long after I folded the letter carefully and slipped it into my purse. Watch the paperwork. That was exactly what I intended to do. Court resumed briefly that afternoon, but Judge Coleman postponed the main hearing for another week after Robert officially withdrew from the case. The entire courtroom buzzed with speculation. My father looked furious, Daniel looked nervous. And nervous men make mistakes. As people filtered toward the exits, my father finally approached me directly for the first time all day. He stopped a few feet away, close enough for me to smell his cologne, the same brand he'd worn my entire life. You think you're clever? He asked quietly. His voice had changed. Less explosive now. More dangerous. I met his stare calmly. No, I said, I think something's wrong. There's nothing wrong except you coming back here stirring up trouble. You transferred property to a caregiver. His jaw tightened instantly. That was my decision. Was it? His eyes flashed with anger. Then, before he could answer, Daniel stepped between us. She's trying to manipulate you, he snapped at my father. That's what she does. I looked at my brother carefully. At 50 years old, Daniel still carried himself like a teenager desperate for approval. Expensive watch, expensive boots, permanent chip on his shoulder. Some people grow older without ever truly growing up. Daniel pointed toward me aggressively. You disappear for 20 years, and suddenly you care about Dad's finances. I care whether he understands what he's signing. He understands perfectly. Then why are you panicking? That hit him harder than I expected. His face reddened immediately. I'm not panicking. Really? Stop talking to me like I'm stupid. Then stop behaving like a guilty man. My father slammed his cane against the courthouse floor. That's enough. Several people turned to stare. My father lowered his voice again. You're embarrassing this family. I almost laughed at that. After everything that had happened, he still thought appearances mattered most. I looked directly at him. No, I said quietly. Somebody already did that. Then I walked away. That evening, Linda invited me to dinner at my father's house. The invitation surprised me. My sister and I had barely spoken in years. Still, I accepted. Partly because I needed answers. Partly because I wanted to see the house again before everything exploded completely. The Carter house looked smaller than I remembered. Age does that to childhood places. The white paint near the porch had started peeling. Several shutters hung crooked. The giant oak tree beside the driveway still stood tall, though now its branches sagged heavily with Spanish moss. I parked beside Daniel's truck. Of course he was already there. Inside, the house smelled like roast chicken coffee and old wood polish. Memory hit me hard the second I walked through the front door. For one dangerous moment, I almost expected my mother to appear from the kitchen drying her hands on a towel. Instead, Linda greeted me awkwardly. You came. You invited me. She nodded nervously. Linda had always hated conflict. As children, she survived our family by staying invisible. We sat around the dining room table 30 minutes later. My father at the head, Daniel beside him, Linda across from me. The tension felt thick enough to touch. Nobody spoke much at first. Silverware scraped plates. Ice clinked softly inside water glasses. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. So what exactly do you want, Evelyn? There it was, straight to the point. I set down my fork carefully. The truth, he scoffed. No, you want revenge. That too, I admitted calmly. Linda looked startled by my honesty. My father stared at me coldly. You always thought you were better than this family. I shook my head slowly. No, I said. I just wanted a life that belonged to me. You abandoned your mother. That landed like a punch. Even after all these years, he still knew exactly where to cut. I answered quietly. I called her every week. You left her here alone. I left because staying here was suffocating me. Daniel leaned back in his chair. There she goes, blaming Dad for everything. I ignored him and looked directly at my father. Did you know Daniel transferred waterfront properties into shell companies? The room froze instantly. Daniel slammed his hand onto the table. Jesus Christ. Linda looked between us anxiously. My father frowned. What shell companies? Daniel answered too quickly. Tax planning. I watched my father carefully then. Really watched him. The confusion in his face looked genuine. Not staged. Not manipulated. Genuine. And suddenly I realized something terrifying. He truly might not know everything happening around him. Daniel kept talking rapidly. It's standard business structuring. Ask any accountant. I looked at my father. Did you personally review every transfer document? Yes. When? What? The waterfront transfers. When did you review them? My father hesitated. Just briefly. But long enough. Daniel jumped in immediately. Dad doesn't need to answer interrogations at dinner. I leaned forward slightly. Why are you so afraid of questions? I'm sick of your attitude. And I'm sick of lies. My father suddenly gripped the edge of the table hard. His breathing changed. Sharp. Uneven. Linda stood immediately. Dad? For one frightening moment I thought he might collapse. I moved beside him instinctively. Old training. Old reflexes. Slow breaths, I said calmly. Daniel grabbed my arm angrily. Don't touch him. I pulled free instantly. He needs to sit back. Stay away from him. My father looked disoriented now. Sweat gathered near his forehead. Linda rushed for his medication while I steadied his chair carefully. It's okay, I told him quietly. Just breathe. For a moment. Just one moment. He looked at me not like an enemy, but like a tired old man. After several minutes, his breathing settled again. Nobody spoke. The room had changed. Completely. Then something happened none of us expected. From the hallway outside the dining room, we heard voices. Daniel's voice earlier that afternoon. Recorded. Muffled but clear enough. My father frowned. What is that? Linda looked confused. But I recognized the sound immediately. A phone recording. And then Daniel's recorded voice said words that turned the entire room cold. He barely remembers half the paperwork anyway. Silence. Absolute silence. Daniel went white. Slowly. My father turned toward him. And for the first time all evening, my brother looked afraid. The recording changed everything. Not loudly. Not dramatically. That's the strange thing about families falling apart. The worst moments often happen in complete silence. My father sat motionless at the dining room table, staring at Daniel like he didn't recognize him anymore. Linda looked close to tears. Daniel, meanwhile, shifted instantly into survival mode. That recording's out of context, he snapped. You don't even know what conversation that came from. I looked toward him calmly. Then explain it. I was talking about stress. Dad forgets things sometimes because he's overwhelmed. My father finally spoke. You recorded me? Daniel blinked rapidly. No, Dad, listen. You recorded private conversations in my house. It wasn't like that. The anger in my father's face slowly faded into something worse. Disappointment. At his age, disappointment carries more weight than rage ever could. Linda quietly admitted the truth a few moments later. She had recorded the conversation accidentally while trying to save voicemail instructions from Daniel about caregiving schedules. The phone had remained recording in her purse. Nobody planned to hear Daniel say those words. Sometimes truth exposes itself without permission. Dinner ended shortly afterward. My father retreated upstairs without another word. Daniel stormed outside furious. Linda sat alone at the kitchen table, staring into space while I helped clear dishes in silence. Finally, she spoke softly. I think he's been controlling everything for years. I stopped drying a plate. You knew. I suspected. That's not the same thing. Tears filled her eyes immediately. You don't understand what it's like staying here, she whispered. Every day somebody's angry. Every day somebody's manipulating somebody else. I leaned against the counter quietly. Because honestly, I did understand. More than she realized. Linda looked at me carefully. Did you ever hate us for staying? The question caught me off guard. I answered honestly. Number. Then after a pause, I hated that nobody protected Mom. Linda broke down crying after that. Not loudly. Just years of exhaustion finally leaking out all at once. And for the first time in decades, I stopped seeing my sister as part of the problem. She was surviving it too. 3 days later, the final hearing began. Savannah Probate Court was more crowded this time. Word had spread. Family estate battles involving wealthy people always attracted attention in smaller southern cities, especially when rumors of fraud entered the picture. I arrived early wearing a charcoal gray suit and carrying 2 organized binders beneath my arm. Old habits from Navy litigation days. Preparation calms nerves. My father entered 10 minutes later with a new attorney named Carl Whitmore. Whitmore looked aggressive in the way insecure lawyers often do. Loud voice, sharp movements, expensive cufflinks designed to impress people. He barely glanced at me before smirking confidently. That told me he underestimated me. A mistake many men made over the years. Daniel walked in behind them looking exhausted. He hadn't slept much. You could see it in his eyes. Good. Pressure reveals character. Judge Coleman entered promptly at 9 o'clock. Everybody stood. The room settled quickly. Whitmore opened aggressively. Your Honor, this entire petition is built on emotional grievances rather than legal evidence. I sat quietly listening. He continued for nearly 20 minutes painting me as an estranged daughter returning home for financial gain after decades away. Classic strategy. Attack motives before facts emerge. Several times he referred to my military career dismissively. As admirable as service may be, he said once it has no relevance to estate administration. I almost smiled at that, because he had no idea how much my career prepared me for exactly this situation. When he finally finished, Judge Coleman looked toward me. Ms. Carter. I stood slowly. The courtroom became very quiet. At first I began calmly. I believed this hearing concerned inheritance fairness. I opened the first binder carefully. Now I believe it concerns exploitation. Daniel shifted immediately beside my father. I continued. Over the last 14 months, 6 properties belonging to Richard Carter were transferred into holding companies connected directly or indirectly to Daniel Carter. Whitmore interrupted instantly. Standard asset management. I slid documents toward the clerk. Alongside these transfers came revised medical authorizations signed during periods of documented cognitive evaluation. That got Judge Coleman's attention. Whitmore objected again. I remained calm. Your Honor, I also submit financial records showing caregiver compensation exceeding legally documented agreements by nearly $200,000. Murmurs spread through the courtroom. Daniel whispered something angrily to Whitmore. Judge Coleman reviewed several pages carefully. Then she looked toward my father. Mr. Carter, were you aware of these transactions in detail? My father opened his mouth, paused, then slowly said, I believed I was. The room shifted instantly. Not legally, emotionally. People could feel it. A powerful old man suddenly sounding uncertain. Whitmore stepped in quickly. My client trusted his son with administrative responsibilities. That does not constitute fraud. No, I agreed quietly, but forged signatures might. Daniel shot to his feet. That's bullshit. Judge Coleman slammed her gavel. Sit down immediately. I handed another document forward. Handwriting analysis. Signature comparisons. Transfer inconsistencies. Whitmore's confidence visibly weakened as he flipped through pages faster and faster. Then came the final blow. Teresa Molina, my father's caregiver. She entered nervously and took the witness stand. At first she tried protecting Daniel. You could tell. Short answers, avoiding eye contact. Then I asked one simple question. Ms. Molina, who instructed you to bring documents to Mr. Carter during medication hours? Silence. Whitmore objected again. Judge Coleman overruled him. Teresa looked down at her hands. Finally she whispered. Daniel did. The courtroom erupted into noise. Judge Coleman called repeatedly for order. Daniel stood again furious. She's lying. I turned toward him calmly. No, I said softly. You just never thought I'd come back. That line hit harder than shouting ever could. Daniel's face twisted with panic now. Real panic. Not anger anymore. Fear. Pure fear. My father stared at him in disbelief. And suddenly I saw something heartbreaking. Richard Carter, the man who dominated every room his entire life, finally realizing his own son had manipulated him. Not for weeks. For years. Judge Coleman reviewed the final evidence silently. Then I removed one last item from my binder. My mother's letter. I would like permission to read a statement written by Eleanor Carter before her death, Whitmore objected weakly. Judge Coleman allowed it. My hand stayed steady as I unfolded the paper. But my voice nearly broke anyway, because hearing my mother again after all these years still hurt. I read slowly. Richard trusts family more than he trusts himself now. Please protect him from anyone who mistakes his love for weakness. The courtroom went completely silent. My father lowered his head, and to my shock, I saw tears falling onto his hands. After the hearing ended, nobody spoke to each other right away. The courtroom emptied slowly beneath low murmurs and uncomfortable silence. Judge Coleman ordered a temporary freeze on all disputed estate transfers pending a formal investigation. Daniel's attorney requested additional time. Teresa Molina left crying. Reporters near the courthouse entrance waited hopefully for drama that never came. At our age, public scenes become exhausting. Nobody wins them. My father remained seated long after everyone else stood. He looked smaller somehow. Not physically. Spiritually. Like a man finally seeing the full cost of his own blindness. Daniel tried approaching him once outside the courtroom. "Dad, listen to me. Not now." That was all my father said. But the coldness in his voice stunned even Daniel. For most of our lives, my brother had survived on our father's approval the way some people survive on oxygen. And now suddenly, that approval was gone. Daniel looked toward me with open hatred. "This is what you wanted." "No," I answered quietly. "This is what you created." He shook his head bitterly. "You always thought you were better than us." I almost responded. Almost defended myself. But after 52 years, I'd learned something important. People only hear truth when they're ready for it. And Daniel wasn't ready. Not yet. He walked away without another word. I watched him disappear into the rain outside the courthouse shoulders, tense hands shoved into his coat pockets, like an angry little boy pretending to be a man. Then Linda approached me carefully. "Dad wants to see you tonight." I looked at her. Alone. That evening I drove back to the family house just after sunset. The rain had finally stopped. Wet streets reflected yellow porch lights and passing headlights across quiet Savannah neighborhoods. Everything looked softer after rain. Even painful places. My father sat alone on the back porch when I arrived. One lamp glowed beside him near an untouched glass of iced tea. The old wooden swing creaked gently beneath his weight. For a second, seeing him there reminded me painfully of childhood summers when he still laughed easily, before money hardened him, before pride swallowed everything. He didn't look up immediately when I stepped outside. "You still walk quietly," he said. "Military habit." I sat across from him without speaking. Crickets hummed softly in the darkness beyond the yard. Finally, he exhaled heavily. "I should have listened to your mother more." That sentence alone shocked me. My father almost never admitted mistakes. Not small ones. Certainly not life-sized ones. I stayed quiet, letting him speak at his own pace. Old men who spent decades controlling conversations don't surrender words easily. After a while, he rubbed his hands together slowly. "You know what the worst part is?" he asked. "What?" I think some part of me already knew. His voice sounded tired. Not angry anymore, just tired. I knew Daniel pushed too hard, he admitted. I knew things felt off sometimes. He swallowed hard. But admitting that would have meant admitting I was getting weak. "You're getting older," I said gently. "That's not the same thing." "No," I agreed quietly, "it isn't." He stared out toward the dark backyard. "When your mother got sick," he paused. I spent every day terrified. That caught me off guard. My father never spoke openly about fear. I thought if I controlled everything tightly enough, he continued, maybe I could stop life from falling apart. His eyes finally met mine. But life falls apart anyway. There it was. The truth beneath all his anger all these years. Fear. Not hatred. Fear. Fear of losing control. Fear of losing family. Fear of becoming unnecessary. I leaned back slowly in my chair. "For what it's worth," I said, "Mom never blamed you." His face tightened painfully. I blamed myself enough for both of us. Silence settled again. Soft. Heavy. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked in the distance. Then my father surprised me again. "I was proud of you," he said quietly. I looked at him carefully. "What?" "The Navy." He gave a weak shake of his head. I just didn't know how to say it. 22 years. 22 years I'd waited to hear those words. And somehow now that they finally arrived, they didn't feel victorious. Just sad. My father rubbed his eyes tiredly. "When people in town talked about you," he admitted, "I always pretended not to care." He gave a faint, bitter smile. "But every time somebody mentioned Commander Carter," he paused. I listened. Emotion rose unexpectedly inside my chest. Not anger. Not revenge. Grief. Grief for all the years pride stole from both of us. "You hurt Mom," I said quietly. His eyes lowered immediately. "I know. You hurt me too." "I know that too." For a long moment neither of us spoke again. Then he asked softly, "Why'd you really come back, Evelyn?" The honest answer surprised even me. "Because somebody had to protect you." His face crumpled slightly after that. Not dramatically. Just enough. Age strips performance away from people eventually. What remains is usually the truth. "I spent my whole life respecting strength," he murmured. "But I never respected yours properly." Tears burned behind my eyes, but I held them back. Military training never fully leaves you. My father glanced toward the dark house behind us. Tomorrow I'm changing the estate again. You don't need to explain that to me. Yes, I do. He looked directly at me. I built this family around money because I thought money kept people together. His voice weakened. Turns out it just gave us more ways to hurt each other. That sentence stayed with me because it was true. I had seen wealthy families destroy themselves over inheritance, and poor families survive beautifully with almost nothing. Money never creates character. It only exposes it. My father straightened slowly. The house on Tybee Island, he said. Your mother wanted you to have it someday. I shook my head immediately. I don't need most of this. What do you want? I thought about it honestly. Not the money, not the victory, not even revenge anymore. Finally I answered. Mom's letters. His eyes softened. That's all. And the truth. He nodded slowly. Then after a long silence he asked the saddest question I'd ever heard him say. Do you think it's too late for this family? I looked at the old man sitting across from me. A man who had spent decades believing control was the same thing as love. And for the first time in my life, I saw him clearly. Not as a tyrant. Not as a villain. Just as a flawed father who ran out of time before he learned how to say the right things. I answered honestly. No, I said quietly. But it's late. My father died 8 months later. Peacefully. That still surprises me when I say it out loud. For most of my life I assumed Richard Carter would leave this world the same way he lived in it, fighting, shouting, refusing to let go of anything. Instead, he died quietly in his sleep one cold February morning while rain moved across the Georgia coast. Linda found him first. She called me at 6:30. I remember sitting beside my kitchen window in Norfolk holding the phone while dawn slowly brightened the sky outside. For a few seconds neither of us spoke. Then Linda whispered, I think he finally got tired. And somehow, that felt true. The months after the court hearing changed all of us. Not instantly. Real healing never happens instantly. Television stories like pretending families reconcile after one emotional speech. Real life is slower. Messieurs. People backslide. Old resentments return unexpectedly. Trust rebuilds inch by inch. Daniel struggled the most. Once the financial investigation fully exposed the property manipulations, he avoided most of the family for weeks. The state never filed criminal charges because my father refused to pursue them. That decision angered me at first, until my father explained why. He's still my son, he said quietly. I didn't fully agree, but I understood. That's the difficult thing about parenthood, I suppose. Love survives even when trust doesn't. Eventually, Daniel entered counseling for gambling addiction and financial dependency issues. That revelation explained more than I expected. The debt, the desperation, the constant hunger for quick money. Pain travels through families in strange disguises sometimes. Linda began visiting me more often after the funeral. At first, our conversations stayed careful and polite, like two strangers sharing a waiting room. Then slowly, we remembered how to be sisters again. One afternoon, she admitted something painful while helping me unpack old boxes from my mother's attic storage. You know, she said softly, I used to envy you. I looked up from a stack of photo albums. Me, you left. Those two words broke my heart more than she realized. Because leaving never felt brave while I was doing it. Mostly it felt lonely. I spent years eating dinner alone in military apartments, wondering whether independence was worth the cost. But hearing Linda say that made me realize something important. Sometimes staying hurts people too. 3 months after my father's funeral, I moved temporarily into my mother's old Tybee Island house. Small place, nothing fancy. White siding, blue shutters, wraparound porch facing the marsh grass. The floorboards creaked. The plumbing complained constantly. And I loved it immediately. My mother planted hydrangeas along the front walk years earlier. Somehow they still bloomed every spring despite neglect. I spent weeks restoring the house slowly, painting walls, cleaning closets, sorting through decades of memories nobody touched after her death. There's something strangely sacred about handling objects that belonged to someone you loved deeply. Every handwritten grocery list, every recipe card, every old church bulletin folded inside drawers. Tiny proof a person existed. One rainy afternoon I found the final letter. It had slipped behind a dresser drawer in my mother's bedroom. The envelope simply said, for my girls. I sat on the bedroom floor for nearly 10 minutes before opening it. Outside rain tapped softly against the windows, just like the day of the courtroom hearing. Funny how life circles back sometimes. My mother's handwriting looked weaker than before. This letter had clearly been written near the end of her illness. I read slowly. Families don't collapse because of money. They collapse because people stop listening to one another. Your father spent his whole life trying to protect everybody. He just forgot that love cannot survive without gentleness. Please forgive each other where you can. Life becomes very short very quickly. By the time I reached the end, tears blurred the words completely. I cried harder than I had at her funeral. Not because of grief alone, because for the first time in decades, everything finally felt honest. No courtroom, no screaming, no pretending. Just truth, simple and painful. That evening, I carried one of the old porch chairs outside and sat watching sunset spread across the marsh. The sky turned orange and gold over the water. Somewhere nearby, children laughed while riding bicycles down the street. Ordinary life. Quiet life. The kind I used to think I wanted away from my family. Now I understood something differently. Peace doesn't come from escaping your past completely. It comes from finally facing it honestly. I thought about my father often after his death. Not the angry version from the courtroom. Not the towering businessman everybody feared. But the tired old man sitting on the porch, admitting he spent his life misunderstanding strength. And strangely enough, I forgave him. Not because he deserved perfection, but because none of us ever truly become the parents, children, or people we imagined we would be. We just try. And sometimes if we're lucky, we get one final chance to say what should have been said years earlier. Before time runs out, I still keep my mother's letters in the living room drawer beside my favorite chair. Some evenings I reread them while listening to rain move across the coast. And every time I remember the lesson this whole painful journey taught me, money reveals people, but forgiveness restores them. If this story touched you in some way, if it reminded you of someone you lost, someone you still need to forgive, or maybe someone you should call before it's too late, I hope you'll carry that feeling with you tonight. And if you believe stories like this matter, stories about family, regret, truth, and second chances, then stay with us for the next one. Because sometimes hearing another person's story helps us heal parts of our own.